In a previous video, I called Brooke Belk a Southern poet and said that, like many other Southern poets, she is obsessed by tradition and ancestry. The poem by Belk that I'm going to read and discuss today is, in fact, called Ancestry, but it illustrates that these concerns of hers reach much further back than her immediate ancestry, in this case, to a place far removed from the modern North American South. But before I read the poem, a little background. Hold a shell to your ear and listen to the surging rhythm of your blood. In, out, the eternal rhythm. When I was a kid, I read in a book that simple people mistakenly thought that they were hearing in a seashell waves crashing on a distant shore. But as it turns out, the learned author was wrong and the simple people were right. The blood that courses in our veins has exactly the same proportions of minerals, salt, iron, potassium, magnesium, and so on, as does seawater. Why? What accounts for this astonishing fact? Well, our blood carries an evolutionary memory. We are periodically, rhythmically inundated by a liquid, our blood, that recalls the amniotic fluid of our great mother, from which our ancestors emerged millions of years ago. Our blood carries an evolutionary memory. We are periodically, rhythmically inundated by a liquid, our blood, that recalls the amniotic fluid of our great mother, from which our ancestors emerged billions of years ago. Even if you did not know this, your body remembers. It remembers the tides 3.5 billion years ago, in and out, systole and diastole. The sea runs in our veins, and as long as it does, in its eternal iambs, the prognosis for poetry is excellent. That said, here's Brooke Belk's poem, Ancestry. In the north, the shell call tolled, whelk to the child's ear, tolling in blood, her blood, the ocean's echo. It rushed her to laughter. She ran to her mother who swept her up, tossed her up windward, the north wind, eater of blood-warm words. They walked to the water. The girl's ankles stung her like drums at the head of ore-born rows of men that later would be every image the girl knew of fathers, of her father, eater of blood-warm lives. It was eons of laters ago that she stood again on this beach at light rise, and yet I still see her, watching a sailing so crowded with drum sounds that their echoes snared from her the whelk, the ocean, her laughter, her mother, before fading lured toward other fathers who'd fall row by row, blood-warm bodies stilled, drum sounds that echoed every other leaving whose shoreline the girl had wandered, eyes stinging, then drying like two sand-bound oysters. Shade in my shadow, mother of my blood, daughter of the northernmost reaches anyone ever reached. Reach for your hair now and gather it back. Walk to the rocks and beyond them, walk to the well. Draw now the water that has never hurt you and drink it. Remember, then eat the blood-warm memory whole. Make your body of it and give it to me, that I may watch the light fall and understand everything I've never lost. Brooke Baker Belk, 2018. First, a general note about reading lyric poems. A lyric poem expresses the experience or experiences of a speaker and typically conveys the richness emotionally, intellectually, spiritually of that experience. The 20th century new critics like Wimsatt, Brooks, and Warren taught that as a general rule it is a mistake to identify the speaker of a poem with the poet himself or herself, that one should not consider, for example, biographical details about the poet as relevant to the poem. The poem should stand by itself, was their rule, and what is in it, if it stands by itself, is the voice of the speaker, not the author. It shouldn't require biographical details for its explication. That's fair enough. However, it has always been the case that typically when a person writes a poem to another individual, a love poem for example, he or she intends to speak in his or her own voice, that the speaker of the poem and the author be identical. So, we have that whole tradition of romantic poetry to consider on this issue, and in addition, it is both the case that the words of the speaker in a poem should stand by themselves and not require explication by reference to the author's life, and that poems, especially lyric poems, which use musical language to convey emotion-laden experiences, are first and foremost a means of communicating what the author feels to other people. In this poem, the speaker seems to me clearly to be Miss Belk, speaking of her own ancestry. It's quite a personal poem, and it is also universal because we can relate to it. The poem sets its initial place with the first phrase, "in the north," with all the evocativeness of that word north. A child is holding a whelk to her ear. We learn that the child is a her in the fourth line. The shell is portrayed metaphorically as a bell tolling, and the mechanism of that bell is the child's own blood. The word tolled reverberates with a couple of meanings, a bell-like sound repeated, and something difficult or taxing, a toll, as in, that took a toll on me. In the phrase, the ocean's echo, we get compressed all the evolutionary history that ties together blood and the ocean, that history that I discussed before the reading of the poem. A call, by the way, suggests distance, this reaching across time, and that's what this poem does. But in the next line, we get the child's response. She is oblivious to the tolling in the sense of something taxing or difficult. She is a child, after all, and her wonderful childlike response is laughter. Perhaps you remember responding with that laughter in amazement when you first held a shell to your ear and, quote, heard the ocean, end quote, which was, of course, your own blood pulsing. What do kids do when they experience something delightful? She runs to her mother. Kids want to share the delightful thing. Isn't that a beautiful characteristic of people? That as kids, that our first instinct is to share something wonderful with someone we love. And the mother's response is a loving one. She sweeps the child up, tosses her up. But note that this is not a sentimental love. The child, wet perhaps from the water, she is playing at the ocean, after all, is tossed up windward. And this is the north wind. It's cold. It eats blood-warm words. Eater is not sentimental. It's a harsh reality. The close to spondaic blood-warm words forces a pause to think about that. My own Cherokee ancestors used to dip their children in cold creeks and springs to toughen them up, and that is a different kind of love. In those days, in places like the far north and the American interior woodlands, life could be harsh, and one had to have the stuff to take your joy while enduring it, and good parents taught kids to have that stuff. You walk to the water, the great mother, source of life, but you must endure the stinging, perhaps of salt, of sand, of midges, whatever, against the still childlike skin of the ankles in order to get there. You have to be tough. And this stinging is like drums at the head of orb-born rows of men, that is, men in 2 rows in a Viking longship, their oars bearing them up. There is no archaeological evidence, by the way, that I know of, that the Vikings used drummers on their boats in this way to keep the rhythm of the oars, or even if they had drums. But it's extremely likely that they did have drums, and altogether possible that drummers were used on boats in this way as a kind of pacemaker and goad, a sting to the rowers. And the image in the child's mind of these rowers, her father among them, is the archetype for her of fathers. Every image of fathers, the poem says. And what do we know of this father? He is an eater of blood-warm lives, as the north wind is an eater of blood-warm words. Try speaking into a high wind and you'll get that second phrase. Her father is a fact of nature, like that wind. The stinging of the child's ankles being like the insistent drums is an example, of course, of metaphor. Sloppy textbooks often contain the poorly conceived definition that, quote, a metaphor is a direct comparison of 2 unlike things, end quote. This is, of course, entirely wrong. A metaphor is when one thing is spoken of as though it were another thing. It's not a comparison. It's an invitation to do a comparison. It's left to the reader to do it, the reader or the listener. Poetry is meant to be read aloud. In the next line, we get one of my favorite phrases in the poem. Eons of laters. In geology, an eon is the largest unit of geological time, divided into eras that are further divided into epochs. But in this line, the word is used in the casual sense, as when we say, yeah, I dated that musician, but that was eons ago. So, a lot of somethings have passed for the she of line 2. She is now a grown woman, and there have been a lot of these laters in her life. You will see your father later. So every image of fathers is of them leaving and of the longing for them in their absence. We know that it's the same person because of the verb phrase stood again on this beach at light rise. The adult woman is watching a particularly large setting out, like the armadas of Viking longships that took off for the Viking occupation of Paris in 845, or the invasion of England from 865 to 78. And these sounds crowd out the memory of the Welk, the ocean when she was a child, her laughter, her mother. The sound fades away lured, meaning that it is blown in the direction of the wind. And what is in that direction? Other fathers who will fall, row by row, and be stilled by this woman's father and his fellow warriors. There have been many such leavings of this girl by her father, like this one. And what has been her reaction to these? Eyes stinging, then drying, and in an astonishing simile, the image of the eyes drying like 2 sand-bound oysters. This is life, kid. Buckle up. One of the wonderful things about this poem is it is so vivid, so concrete. Um, One is there on the beach, the kid with the whelk to the ear, these two sand-bound oysters, extraordinarily vivid. In the final stanza, we get a shift in point of view to that of the speaker. We know this because of the first-person pronoun my, as opposed to the third-person recounting of the child and the later woman that child became in the preceding stanzas. The stanza begins with perhaps my favorite word in the poem, shade. What an astonishing word choice. Perfect. This word has a couple of relevant meanings. First, there is the comfort provided by a dark, cool shadow or shade from the sun. Second, there's the archaic use of shade to mean a ghost or spirit, as when in Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid we are told of Orpheus redeeming his wife Eurydice from the shades below, that is, from those in the afterlife. So, the speaker is addressing directly this shade in her shadow. She sees her shadow, and in it the shade or spirit of her ancestor. Isn't that wild? Wow, that vision. And this is like shade on a hot day, a comfort. And in the next line we get blood, which comes up again and again in this poem in the literal sense of the speaker's physical blood, and in the figurative sense here of kin. My blood, my kin. This comforting shade is mother of her blood. She honors her as among those who braved the furthermost north anyone ever reached. And she speaks back across the ages to her and narrates what she wants to see from that ancestor in the past. The gathering back of the ancestor's hair, that taking care of things, ordering them, the walking back beyond the rocks, symbols of hard realities, but also of shelter behind which home and community lie, and the heart of this home and community, the place around which a home is made, a well, source of life-giving fresh water, as opposed to seawater, of water that one can drink, that doesn't sting one's ankles and one's emotions watching one's father depart on it. And as the speaker remembers, she imagines her ancestors remembering, and the eating of the blood is the encapsulation into herself of those memories, a far cry from the kind of eating that her father and his companions do. The body is mostly water, this fresh water, and that water, therefore, is a symbol of life, that life is passed on to her ancestor, the speaker, and that gives the ancestor strength. She can watch the light fall, literally night coming on, but figuratively the heading toward death that we all do, knowing that because life is passed on from her ancestor to her, from her to descendants, this everything, all this history, this tradition, is not lost. The ancestor's body is sustained physically by the water, symbol of life and of community and family, and metaphorically by blood-warm memory. Remembering home and community and ancestry is emotionally sustaining. It is proof even against death. Blood-warm, by the way, is a kenning of the kind used in Germanic verse generally, especially in the Old Norse of the Vikings and in Old English or Anglo-Saxon. A kenning is a formulaic substantive used again and again throughout a body of poetry. The use of this and its transmutation from something horrific to something comforting in the poem is a deft touch, isn't it? Echoing the past being remembered. What a fine poem this is, isn't it? I am so pleased to have been able to share it with you. Please like and subscribe, and check out my other videos on this channel.